All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into this collection of essays, White Queen Psychology and Other Essays for Alice by Ruth Garrett Millikan. And this one really kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of how we think about the mind and language and really like thought itself.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is so interesting about Millikan's work is that she she grounds a lot of these concepts in biological function, which is not something you see very often in these fields.
Yeah, it's kind of like she's saying, forget about the ivory tower. We need to look at evolution and how that shapes our thinking. Even, like simple organisms, they do things that seem to demonstrate like knowledge about their world.
Mm.
And that's important for their survival.
Right, and that's really the basis of her theory of teleosemantics, right? It's this really radical idea that the meaning of a thought comes from its biological function. And that function, the really important part, is that it was shaped by natural selection over millions of years.
Okay, so we're looking at our minds through like a really long evolutionary lens.
Mm-hmm.
But how does that actually explain how thoughts get meaning?
Okay, so think about it like this. What's the heart's function?
To pump blood.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. And that function's been honed by evolution over millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
And Millikan says it's similar for the way our minds work, the mechanisms in our brains.
Yeah.
Their proper function is to produce thoughts that represent the world accurately, true beliefs, because those were the beliefs that helped our ancestors survive.
So are you saying that our minds are kind of like truth-seeking machines?
In a way, yeah. That's the core of biosemantics.
Mm.
It really challenges some traditional views about the mind.
Like,
especially the views that say the mind is totally separate from the body.
right, dualism.
Exactly, dualism. That age-old debate about mind versus matter.
So how does Millikan's view of biosemantics tackle this mind-body problem?
Well, Millikan's approach is really grounded in materialism. The idea that the mind is a product of what's happening physically in the brain. And by saying that intentionality comes from biological function, shaped by evolution, she completely avoids having to come up with some kind of non-physical explanation for thought.
So it's like she's saying there's no separate realm of the mind.
Yeah.
The mind is just what the brain does.
Exactly.
What the brain does is the result of evolution.
Right. Now, this leads to some pretty interesting implications for how accurate our beliefs are. Because if our minds are kind of designed to produce true beliefs,
right,
how do we explain the fact that sometimes we have false beliefs?
Yeah. We all make mistakes. We have misconceptions. That seems like a big challenge to this idea that minds are built for truth.
Yeah, it's a classic problem in philosophy.
It's the problem of error.
Exactly, the problem of error.
Yeah.
And, Millikan, she doesn't shy away from this. She says that those false beliefs, they're often just byproducts of cognitive mechanisms that are, on the whole, reliable.
Okay.
Even the best radar systems sometimes pick up a false signal. That's because it's operating in a really complex world.
Yeah, a messy world.
A messy world, exactly. Our minds are constantly processing information. Sometimes errors just slip in, but overall, our cognitive systems are designed to produce more true beliefs than false ones because, remember, that's what helped our ancestors survive.
That makes sense. So we're basically built for truth.
Yeah.
But sometimes the signal gets scrambled, you could say.
Yeah, you could say that. So she says that we can figure out what mental states mean and what language means by looking at their biological purposes. What are they for? And ultimately, how did those purposes evolve because they helped organisms to survive?
So then how does that, actually work? I can see how, a spider building a web, that's connected to its survival. But what about, human consciousness? That's a lot more complex.
Yeah, well, she's basically arguing that all of our, even our most complex mental processes, they all ultimately stem from biological function.
Right.
Think about it this way. If your ancestors could accurately represent a predator in their mind, they were more likely to avoid being eaten. So those brain states, those representations, they were selected for over time. And gradually, that led to the development of more and more sophisticated intentional states. So thoughts, beliefs, desires, they're all kind of coming out of this evolutionary history.
So it's like intentionality itself is like a tool for survival. That's a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
And speaking of interesting ways to think about things, so you can't really skip over the title essay, White Queen Psychology, which, that reference to Lewis Carroll's White Queen who believed in 6 impossible things before breakfast, definitely kind of grabs your attention.
Right, and she uses that image, because the White Queen kind of represents this idea of like the power of imagination. And Millikan thinks that imagination is really central to human psychology. It's our ability to think about things that don't exist. And that's what allows us to problem solve and to plan and to be creative.
Wait, so like believing in six impossible things is actually a good thing?
Well, not necessarily believing, but imagining them. Absolutely. I mean, think about it. When we plan something, when we solve problems, when we're being creative, it all depends on our ability to create these mental representations of things that aren't actually real yet, right? We can run these simulations in our minds, we can play out hypothetical scenarios, and we can come up with totally new solutions. And that's all thanks to our imagination. It's like our inner White Queen at work.
So white queen psychology isn't really about like believing in fantasies. It's more about using our imagination as a tool to like navigate the world around us.
And it highlights something really important about intentionality. For Millikan, your thoughts don't have to correspond perfectly to some actual object out there in the world. Your thoughts can be about possibilities or hypotheticals, even fictional things.
So like if I think about a unicorn, even though they're not real, my thought still has intentionality. It's still about something.
Exactly.
That's really wild when you think about it.
Yeah, and it's that ability, that White Queen psychology, that allows us to do things that seem impossible, like, planning a trip to the moon before we had the technology to actually do it. We could imagine that goal, that future state of affairs, even though it didn't exist yet.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing. And, this is just the beginning, right? White Queen Psychology and other essays for Alice doesn't just stop there.
No, not at all. She applies this teleosemantic framework to so many different things, like how children learn language and how we perceive the world, and even knowledge itself.
Yeah, I was reading about her take on language acquisition. And it's pretty amazing. You know how kids just, like, pick up language so easily? It seems effortless, but there's so much going on under the surface that we don't see.
Exactly. Millikan says that kids are really good at picking up on the subtle cues that adults give them about what they're referring to. And those cues, along with the child's own developing understanding of the world, help them to figure out what words mean, what they're supposed to do, in terms of communication.
I mean, it's really fascinating how she connects biology and philosophy of language. It's like she's showing us these hidden links between things that seem totally different.
And she does that a lot by using the concept of like natural information, right? So certain features of the environment, things like the shape of an object or the sound of a word, they carry information about the things that cause them, what she calls their producers.
So it's like the world is already talking to us in a way through all these natural signs. Like, paw print tells us about the animal that made it.
Right. And learning language becomes this process of like tuning into that conversation that's already happening, figuring out the connections between signals and where they come from.
So we're not just passively taking in information. We're actually actively engaging with the world and learning to, like, read its language.
Yeah. And that insight goes beyond just language, right? Millikan argues that all of our cognitive abilities, from basic perception to abstract thought, it all boils down to these biological mechanisms for processing this natural information.
It's like our brains are these prediction machines constantly trying to make sense of the world and figure out what's going to happen next.
Exactly. And that ability to predict is crucial for everything we do, from planning our day to, making complex decisions. It's all about anticipating the future.
Millikan's idea that intentionality doesn't need to match up perfectly with, like, real objects is really thought-provoking, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It makes you realize that our minds are capable of thinking about things that don't exist, like those fictional characters or hypothetical situations. We can even think about things that are impossible, like those 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Right. And it's that ability to imagine, to play with possibilities in our minds that makes us so adaptable and creative. It's what allows us to solve problems and come up with new ideas.
It's like our brains are these incredible simulation machines. We can create models of the world in our minds, even if those models include things that aren't real.
Exactly.
And what's really exciting to me is that this idea could maybe explain how we developed our capacity for abstract thought. Like our moral reasoning or our appreciation for art. Maybe those things are also rooted in this evolutionary advantage. We're not just reacting to the world, we're actually shaping it with our White Queen minds.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I think that's what makes Millikan's work so compelling. She's not afraid to like blur the lines between biology and psychology and philosophy to give us this richer, more nuanced view of how our minds actually work.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
And, we've just scratched the surface here, but this deep dive into white queen psychology and other essays for Alice has already given us a lot to think about. It's a book that really makes you question your assumptions about how we think, how we communicate, and really what it means to be human.
Yeah, I think it challenges us to see our minds as these products of this long evolutionary history, shaped by the need to survive and thrive in a really complex world. And maybe to appreciate just how amazing our capacity for white queen psychology really is.
Yeah, I agree.
It's something worth thinking about.
It really is.
And this kind of leads us to another really fascinating aspect of her work, which is um, her exploration of biological categories. She argues that we need to understand categories like, species or organs, not just by their physical traits, like how they look, but also by their evolutionary history and their function, like why do they have those traits?
So it's not just about like sorting organisms into these neat little boxes based on their appearance, but like understanding the why behind those features, where they
Yeah.
came from.
Right, exactly. So, like, take the concept of a heart, for instance. We can define a heart structurally. It's a muscular organ that pumps blood. But Millikan's saying, well, let's look at it functionally. A heart is really, whatever plays the role of circulating blood in an organism. It doesn't have to have a specific form.
Yeah, that makes sense when you consider like how different hearts have evolved in different species. They can look really different.
Exactly. And this functional approach, to biological categories, it has some really important implications for how we understand the mind, too.
Right.
Because the mind is also a product of evolution.
So to really get the meaning of our mental processes, we need to kind of dig into their evolutionary functions. Like, what were they for originally?
Yeah, you got it. And that brings us to her discussion of derived proper functions. This adds like another layer to her theory.
Okay, derived proper functions. Lay it on me. What are those?
Well, think about it this way. A bird's wings, right? Their proper function is to fly. But over time, those wings, they can acquire new functions that kind of build on that original function. We call those derived functions.
Oh, so like using wings for like mating displays or, to signal danger to the flock. Like those weren't the original purpose, but they kind of developed later.
Those are great examples. And so how does this apply to the mind? Well, Millikan suggests that a lot of our cognitive abilities, the way we think, are actually derived proper functions of more basic biological mechanisms. So like our ability to do abstract reasoning, that might be a derived function of brain structures that originally evolved for, spatial navigation or like social interaction in our ancestors.
Wow, that's fascinating. So like, while our distant ancestors might not have been pondering the meaning of life, they had those early cognitive building blocks that eventually allowed us to develop more complex thought processes.
It really is amazing when you think about the efficiency of evolution. It's like evolution's this master tinkerer, always repurposing old tools for new and more sophisticated tasks.
And this evolutionary perspective, I think, is really crucial when we're comparing minds across different species. Like, it's tempting to make those simple analogies, like assuming my dog experiences sadness the same way I do.
Yeah, but Millikan is really careful about that. She emphasizes that we have to analyze the evolutionary pressures and the environmental context that shaped each species' cognitive abilities. We can't just project our own human experiences onto animals without considering their unique evolutionary journey.
It reminds me of that quote, the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. We have to be careful about imposing our limited understanding on all the different minds in the animal kingdom.
Absolutely. Instead of like resorting to this simple anthropomorphism, we should approach the study of animal minds with a sense of wonder and humility, recognizing the unique adaptations that have shaped each species' cognitive, toolkit.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Each species' mind is like finely tuned to its own ecological niche. So while there might be some, shared cognitive foundations across different species, we can't just assume similarities without really investigating.
And speaking of avoiding simplistic thinking, Millikan also challenges some traditional views on perception. She argues that perception isn't just about like passively receiving information from the world.
You mean it's more like an active process
Yeah.
where we're not just, cameras recording the world,
Yeah.
but we're actually interpreting and making meaning out of what we're sensing.
Exactly. She proposes that perception is really intertwined with action. Our perceptual systems evolved not just to represent the world, but to guide our interactions with it, to help us navigate and thrive in our environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, our senses are always giving us information that helps us decide what to do. Like whether to approach something or avoid it or even just keep paying attention to it.
Right. So instead of viewing perception as this separate process that comes before action, she sees them as two sides of the same coin. We perceive in order to act effectively, and then our actions, they shape our perceptions. It's this back and forth thing.
It's like that famous saying, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. Like our perception is influenced by our needs, our goals, our whole evolutionary history.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads us to one of the most intriguing concepts in her book. She calls them push me, pull you representations, named after that weird two-headed creature from the Dr. Dolittle stories.
Okay, push me, pull you representations. I'm all ears. What are those?
Well, imagine, a mental representation that can serve two different purposes at the same time. It can guide your actions and it can represent the world. So, just like the push me pull you could move in two directions at once, these representations can be both a map and a set of instructions.
So it's like our brains are constantly running these really sophisticated simulations, seamlessly integrating information about the world with like instructions for how to interact with it.
That's a great way to think about it. Think about your mental representation of, say, a door. It contains information about its shape, size, location. That represents the door in your mind.
And the guiding action part would be.
Well, that same representation also tells you how to interact with the door, how to open it, close it, walk through it. It's not just a passive picture, it's like an active blueprint for engaging with the world.
This makes me wonder, if our mental representations are so tied up with action,
Yeah.
does that blur the lines between perception and action even more? Like, can we really even separate them?
That's a great question, and it goes right to the heart of what Millikan's trying to do. She's challenging this traditional view that there's this neat separation between perceiving the world and acting on it. Maybe that's just an illusion. Maybe it's our way of oversimplifying these really complex cognitive processes.
So it's not that we perceive the world and then decide how to act, but it's more like perception and action are always influencing each other. And that
Yeah.
shapes how we experience the world, right?
It's this constant back and forth and this dynamic interplay. It's what allows us to navigate this complex world, to make predictions and plan our actions in a way that would be impossible if we were just passively receiving sensory data. It's through this constant loop of perception and action that we learn and adapt and ultimately thrive in our environment.
This also kind of ties back to her ideas about knowledge and justification, doesn't it? Like she
Yeah.
doesn't agree with that traditional view that knowledge requires certainty.
Oh, you're right. From an evolutionary perspective, certainty is often impossible. And yet, organisms still need to make reliable judgments to survive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a gazelle doesn't need to be certain a lion is hiding in the bushes. It just needs enough evidence to warrant running away.
Yeah, it's like evolution is this pragmatist saying, look, you don't need perfect knowledge to get by. Just be right often enough to survive and reproduce. It really captures that practical, grounded nature of her approach. She suggests that our cognitive systems evolved to make judgments based on, probabilities, like what's most likely to be true based on the evidence we have. We don't need to be absolutely certain.
So it's not about achieving perfect knowledge. It's more about making the best choices we can with the information we have available at the time.
Exactly. And this pragmatic view of knowledge also applies to how we understand science. Science is also about building models and making predictions based on the best available evidence, even though we can never be totally certain about our conclusions.
Right. It's like that gazelle fleeing from potential danger.
Hmm.
Scientists are constantly revising their understanding of the world based on new evidence. Knowledge is this ongoing process of inquiry and revision, not a static set of absolute truths.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Millikan's work challenges us to embrace a more realistic view of knowledge, recognizing that our understanding of the world is always evolving, and open to new interpretations.
And I think that's kind of refreshing.
Yeah.
It reminds us that uncertainty isn't a weakness. It's actually what drives scientific progress. It's what keeps us asking questions and trying to understand the world around us.
That's a really good point. By acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, we actually open ourselves up to new discoveries and deeper understanding.
This has been such an interesting conversation, and I'm really eager to hear more about how Millikan's ideas apply to other areas of human experience.
Well, there's definitely a lot more to explore, from the social dimension of cognition to the evolution of language. So much to talk about.
Well, let's dive in then. Let's keep exploring Millikan's ideas in the next part of our deep dive.
It's funny, isn't it? We often think of philosophy as this like abstract, head in the clouds kind of thing. But Millikan's work is so grounded in biology and the natural world. She reminds us that our minds aren't just these isolated things floating around out there.
Yeah, she's really emphasizing that connection between mind and body, isn't she? Like, to understand the mind, you got to understand life itself. It's a really refreshing perspective.
Definitely. And that leads us to another important aspect of her work, which is her focus on the social dimension of cognition. She argues that our minds are really shaped by our interactions with others.
Right. I was thinking about her essay, Shared Intentions. She talks about how humans have this unique ability to, like, collaborate and work towards common goals, which is something that really sets us apart from other species.
And what's really cool is how she connects this idea of shared intentionality back to her theory of teleosemantics. She proposes that our ability to understand and share intentions with other people, it's a product of our evolutionary history. Basically, cooperation gave our ancestors a survival advantage.
So groups that could cooperate effectively were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. And that led to the development of these, like, really complex social cognitive skills.
And this social dimension of cognition, it has huge implications for how we understand things like language, morality, culture, all the things that make us human.
It's like our minds aren't just these individual things. They're interconnected, woven into this larger social fabric. We're constantly shaping each other's minds through our interactions.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And, this social dimension is really what sets us apart. I mean, some species cooperate, but humans have taken it to a whole other level.
Yeah, it's evident in everything we do. Our complex language systems, our shared beliefs, our moral codes, the different cultures we create, it all points to this amazing ability to understand and work together.
And Millikan argues that this ability comes from our evolutionary past as a highly social species. Over time, we've developed these increasingly sophisticated ways of basically reading each other's minds, so we can anticipate actions, figure out intentions, and coordinate our behavior in really precise ways.
We've only scratched the surface here,
Yeah.
but I hope our exploration of Ruth Garrett Millikan's work
Mm-hmm.
has given you a sense of wonder
Yeah,
about the human mind and its place in the universe.
me too.
Thanks for joining us,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.